Opiates, opioids, and the problems they cause are in the headlines daily, but this drug's use actually started thousands of years ago. In this week's episode, we look at the physician's role in the opioid crisis and the deadly combination of opiates and benzodiazepines. We have excerpts from interviews with Dr. Bertha Madras, as well as author Sam Quinones, Dr. Anna Lembke, addiction specialist Shelley Sprague, and author David Sheff. And now DrDrew.com presents The History of Opium. Here's a quote from physician Dr. Jacqueline Carley. After a long day of prescribing painkillers, I've often asked myself, am I contributing to the opioid crisis? And no doubt many physicians have asked themselves this question, especially in the wake of increasing opioid-related deaths that continue to plague the country. Unfortunately, many physicians ignore their conscience, and they continue to justify questionable prescribing. While drug companies, drug distributors, and pharmacies bear some responsibility for the current epidemic, many experts have concluded that it is us, physicians, most of whom well-intentioned, we're to blame. Dr. Anna Lembke.
Well, as I became just generally more aware of the prevalence of addiction in my psychiatric patients, and I started asking them about their drug and alcohol use, what started to emerge in their stories is that they were also misusing and or addicted to prescriptions that they had obtained legally through a doctor. And sometimes that doctor was me. So that was a hard reality I had to face too, that the stimulants and the benzodiazepines primarily that I was prescribing, the patients were not using them, as intended. So that just became part of my general awareness in the early aughts. And also what really galvanized me to want to educate other doctors about addiction, knowing that I myself was as ignorant as anybody in the beginning.
Despite the fact that many of the doctors who overprescribed opiates were trained to use them sparingly, there was a whole generation that was trained to use them excessively. Opioids are extremely addictive. Dr. Bertha Madras?
And the circuitry is very important because the frontal cortex, the frontal part of your brain, is critical for putting on the brakes, for impulse control, for judgment. And that part of the brain, as you gradually slide into a deeper and deeper state of addiction, that piece of the brain becomes more and more disconnected from the reward system of the brain, from the amygdala, which is the system that drives emotions, drives impulses, and the stop part of the brain just is no longer able to control what we call the more primitive parts of the brain that are just continue to seek drugs.
Up until the 1980s, potent narcotics were reserved almost exclusively to treat cancer pain, post-surgical pain, end-of-life pain, but that was about to change. Girded by the published accounts in a prestigious medical journal that downplayed the addictive properties of opiates, a large sector of the medical community was swept up in the prospect of using them to treat a broader range of ailments that included chronic non-cancer pain. Dr. Kathleen Foley and Dr. Russell Portnoy, who had co-authored one of two studies we'd mentioned previously in the journal Pain, were integral in the advent of a new medical specialty called palliative care, whose goal was to treat pain in all its forms. Both Foley and Portnoy would become well-known spokespeople in the emerging field of pain management. Dr. Anna Lembke.
What happened was that the pharmaceutical industry convinced doctors that opioid prescribing was beneficial in the case of chronic pain by trotting out these various academic luminaries, people with important academic titles who worked at, important academic or preeminent hospitals and clinics, and pharma essentially promoted the careers of these individuals, paid for them to travel all over the country to speak at continuing medical education courses. I think a really important piece to understand this is that, as doctors working on the front lines in clinical care do not have time to read all of these journal articles. There are thousands of them being published more every year. And many doctors don't really have the expertise to interpret them, even if they did read them. They're focused on taking care of patients. So they rely on these continuing medical education courses and these so-called academic thought leaders who present at these courses to really tell them what the evidence shows. And that's essentially, what happened with the opioid epidemic in the 90s and early aughts, is that these various academic thought leaders, promoted and paid for by pharma, trotted out very weak evidence to convince the average prescriber that prescribing opioids for chronic pain was both safe and effective, when in fact neither of those things is true.
During this time period, residents of a poor region of Nayarit, Mexico, were establishing what would become a wildly successful low-tech narcotics trade that operated in major cities all over the United States. These small groups, these cells, were nonviolent and valued customer service. They kept low profiles as they delivered high-quality heroin known as black tar to the doorsteps of their mostly white middle-class customers, virtually ensuring they continued enslavement to the drug. They were like Domino's or Pizza Hut. They delivered and they valued their customers. Sam Quinones.
The importance of OxyContin in this story is one of the important reasons it's important is because OxyContin was the bridge from those low-dose opioids to heroin. There was no real bridge before OxyContin came along and took you up to very high daily dosage, 150, 200, 300 milligrams a day. People got desperate. They got cut off from their insurance. They lost. The doctor stopped prescribing. A variety of things would happen. They would switch to the street, which now had a robust opioid black market pills. And there they would find that those pills were available, but they were very expensive, $1 a milligram usually, and that would then send them, because they couldn't afford that, they would then send them eventually to heroin.
While that heroin distribution was evolving, physicians continued to develop increasingly religious enthusiasm. Here is Dr. Nathaniel Katz, a pain specialist. Quote, "My fellowship director even told me, if you have pain, you can't get addicted to opiates because the pain soaks up the euphoria." As though euphoria was the only factor in addiction. The potential to relieve pain inspired people to enter medicine, but the actual experience of alleviating it for patients is also a powerful motivator. Arguably, some amount of pain is inherent in the vast majority of medical complaints, so having a variety of tools at our disposal was very gratifying. Prior to the 1980s, physicians were trained to abstain from prescribing opiates unless absolutely necessary. But that attitude changed when the notion that opioids, quote, aren't addictive as we previously thought, began to take hold. A growing population of medical professionals started championing their use to treat everything, from sprained ankles to tooth extractions, and use them at high quantities and high frequency. Bolstered by the narrow claim published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Porter and Jick, and in Pain by Portnoy and Foley, legions of physicians started writing prescriptions for potent narcotics and sending patients down a path of addiction and or dependency. In 1995, Purdue Pharmaceutical introduced OxyContin, as we discussed. This was allowed by the FDA to put problematic information on its labeling. With packaging that claimed the drug was virtually non-addictive, here it goes, on it went. The growing field of pain management endeavored to destigmatize what they called opiophobia, fear of opiates. Many medical professionals were paid handsomely to promote the drug use. Dr. Portnoy himself served as a powerful and effective spokesperson for OxyContin. Doctors were told they needn't worry about addiction because, as we said, the euphoric effects were countered by the pain. Anesthesiologists became managers of giant chronic pain clinics, some well-meaning physicians, but some crooked. Some opened storefronts and clinics, preying on the injured and the addicted. These pill mills, as they were called, were responsible for prescribing staggering amounts of narcotics to all who entered. No questions asked, but you have to remember, pain was what the patient said it was, and so pain control was what the patient said it was. So why did you need a doctor? You just needed the patient to look at a menu and point at what he or she needed to control their pain. This was the philosophy of the day. Of course, many of these maintained cash-only transactions. The Joint Commission for Accreditation on Healthcare, which accredits all healthcare organizations, also chimed in, demanding that doctors treat pain as the fifth vital sign. Pain management societies and organizations demanded action on behalf of their patients. Evil doctors like me were not treating pain adequately, and worse yet, taking people off painkillers. How dare I do that? Many states adopted intractable pain acts, which removed sanctions against prescribing of large amounts. Patients now expected and demanded large amounts of drugs. Physicians weren't trained to ferret out addiction. This all created a perfect environment for severe addiction to develop. Nothing ends a patient encounter quicker than pulling out your prescription pad. And fighting with an addict is terribly time-consuming and extremely emotionally draining. Chronic pain patients are often very difficult, time-consuming, and doctors just don't have it, so the prescription pads were readily opened, and they were being encouraged to do so. Adding to the physician concern was specters of lawsuits holding physicians responsible for inadequate treatment of pain. Not only were these malpractice lawsuits, but these were criminal suits and civil suits. In California, 2001, Dr. Wing Chin was ordered to pay $1.5 million to the children of a patient who died under his care. The jury found him guilty of elder abuse because the patient suffered unnecessary pain prior to his death. This and several other decisions sending physicians into criminal courts sent shockwaves through the medical community. Physicians were afraid now not to treat pain and sent everything to the pain management doctors who denied the existence of addiction. Now, the vast majority of people who are currently addicted to opioids can trace their addiction to prescription pills, legally, well-meaningfully prescribed. People who received an initial prescription for minor injuries that then continued, many of them now are gone. They have died of opiate addiction. Opiates began being prescribed very aggressively in the mid-1990s, and the incidence of addiction exploded. As doctors realized they began to render their patients dependent or addicted, they would start to cut off the supply. It was there that the Mexican drug dealers would wander in, patiently waiting outside, for instance, support meetings for methadone treatment centers, free samples dispensed, reeling in the patients. Sam Quinones?
The system that I tried to describe in Dreamland is actually a system that's fairly widespread, certainly in the Los Angeles area, people having a delivery system. Heroin allows for that. Opioids allow for a business model situation where you can set up a business really along business principles. So you're trying to keep that customer happy. You're trying to convenience is very important. I focus on one group, though, a group of guys out of one small town in a small state in Mexico called Nayarit. The name of the town is Jalisco. These guys are important to this story, first because they perfected the system, and many of these guys came up from this town and then surrounding villages to work in it, sometimes as drivers, delivering the dope, sometimes as operators, taking addicts' phone calls. Sometimes these were guys owning crews outright or delivering, supplying those crews. But whatever the case, most of the guys from that town got involved in this. They perfected it. They got it down to almost a science. And then, crucially, because there were so many of them, they all were from the same town, they could not kill each other in San Fernando Valley, which is where they started. Right? They're all from the same town, so they're going to create problems back home if they do that. There was a lot of competition, but oftentimes they're related to the competition, or cousins or brothers-in-law, what have you. And so these guys did what any capitalist enterprise does when it begins to see declining profitability, and that is look for new markets. And so they expanded, and it was that expansion that makes them crucial to this story. I think they began to look for new markets. First was Pomona, Ontario. They went from the valley out to Pomona, Ontario, out to Pasadena, then San Diego. Then it was Reno, Portland, Phoenix area. Then another wave was like Omaha, Denver, Boise, Salt Lake, etc. All these different, and so they begin through beginning in the late 80s, through into really till today. But certainly the 90s were a great time of enormous expansion. They were always looking for new markets, and every place they'd go, they would find the following. They would find a town, this was in the early to mid-1990s, where that number of addicts was static. It was not a growing market. And so in order to do that, to function, they had to start stealing addicts from each other. Because there's 3 crews, say there's 100 addicts in Salt Lake City, whatever it happens to be, you have to start stealing from other people. And the way you do that is you become really great at marketing and convenience and customer service, because you want those addicts to come to you. So you bring me 5 new customers, I'll give you 50 free balloons of heroin. That kind of come on is constant. They were fully into the expansion mode when this promotion of narcotic painkillers by modern, legitimate American medicine began to take place in the mid to late 1990s. And by very weird coincidence. They just happened to have leapt the Mississippi River and landed one guy in particular, in Columbus, Ohio, as Columbus was becoming one of the great centers of pill promotion in this pain revolution that was taking place in the late 1990s. They just happened to collide. Their aggressive marketing and expansion collided with this very aggressive marketing of pain pills as the solution to every American's pain of any kind, which was going to be risk-free, non-addictive if you were in pain, et cetera, et cetera. And so these two forces, the reason I write about the Jalisco boys from Jalisco, Nayarit, is not because they're the only heroin traffickers from Mexico. There are others. They are important because they are the ones who collide with this new promotion of pain pills, and together you begin to find that area first. People switching from pain pill that they're using for 300 milligrams a day to the far, far cheaper and yet just as potent black tar heroin sold by these guys from Jalisco, Nayarit.
As OxyContin's popularity grew, the pills became currency in many parts of the country. The street value made selling them to other addicts practically irresistible, and then they could get the lower-cost heroin, get the same and better effects. So many seamlessly switched over to black tar heroin when their doctors cut them off and when they started selling their pills. Treating pain successfully, of course, every physician wishes for, but unlike vital signs, pain is a subjective experience. Pain is a sensation, but is derived from a complex combination of physical, emotional, and psychological processes. Dr. John Bonica knew this when he opened the first pain clinic in 1960. Sam Quinones.
John Bonica in University of Washington is really the pioneer in this country, I think, of pain management. He was the first one to put a lot of thought into it. He suffered from chronic pain himself. He had been a pro wrestler in college and had cauliflower ears and was very painful. He suffered from that all his life. And he began the first clinic, really, that seriously studied pain. This was at the University of Washington, and I'm not sure exactly why, but it very naturally, I think, occurred to him and his colleagues as he expanded the center that pain in each is different in each individual, and therefore each individual needs to be treated with an array of treatments that may differ wildly from one person to the next, from this man to that woman to this child. And they developed this idea that really it was a wide array of things. It could be acupuncture, it could be physical therapy, a big one, cognitive behavioral therapy, massage, swimming, diet, and then some degree, probably usually a fairly small amount of opioid painkillers could also be part of the mix, particularly for the most serious cases.
Advocating a multidisciplinary approach to treating pain, his clinic employed not only doctors, but a phalanx of specialists, including occupational therapists, physical therapists, neurobiofeedback specialists, psychologists, social workers, all endeavoring to discover and treat the cause of pain, not just the symptoms. Despite evidence that this kind of treatment was more effective and remains more effective, insurance companies refused to pay. It seemed that they would rather pay for a single visit and an opiate prescription. Much less expensive. Sam Quinones.
The insurance companies were crucial in this story too, because they used to reimburse for all that. And so a pain doctor would say, gee, let's see, I've got all these tools in my toolbox to treat your pain. So let's see, we're going to try, let's say half dozen. So there's 6 treatments and it could be, again, chiropractic medicine, could be physical therapy, could be a few a moderate amount of opioids, and the insurance companies reimburse for all that, and what they found was that worked over the long term. That worked, but that they had all to be put into play. You couldn't just take 1 or 2. You had to have all 6, and you would tinker with it. It would be a patient-doctor relationship of just the kind that probably is so important in medicine, where you're listening, where you're saying, okay, we're gonna dial back this a little bit, and maybe up that a little bit. It was a tinkering process that took place over years, and then it became impossible. The insurance companies began to cut back on what they'd reimburse for. That was huge in this whole story. After a while, doctors found themselves in a position where I'm being asked to cure all Americans' pain, and increasingly I have but one tool to do it, and that is the narcotic painkiller pill, and because the insurance companies won't reimburse for job counseling, marital counseling, psychological counseling, physical therapy, all these different things they would not reimburse for. And this left the doctor with really just nothing in the toolbox but pain pills.
And patients, of course, were also content with taking a pill, though they did not recognize what was happening to them. Doctors ignored what they knew about opiates, continuously citing weak research published decades prior. Unfortunately, treating the symptoms rather than the cause is still a preference. By the mid-2000s, millions upon millions of chronic pain patients were being treated with opioids. The United States consumes roughly 80% of the world's opiates. In 2016, there were 60,000 opioid-related deaths. Once the addiction takes hold, people lose their capacity to choose. They become slaves to the drug. Worse yet is lack of documentation. The patient follow-up has typically been very poor, reliant on patients' and addicts' own assessments, which are unreliable. There has been a shocking lack of interest in tracking both the benefits and negative effects of the drug. Sam Quinones?
No, I think that there was not that understanding that pain pills are this double-edged sword. They work in certain very limited ways, in certain like I would say boxes you can use them in, and then they end up being far more trouble and danger than they're worth, and that has to do with length of time, I think, that you're exposed to them. Dosage, I think, is also part of it, and then also I do believe they tend to push people. This is my impression anyway. They tend to push people into isolation, which further aggravates whatever pain problems. So people are kind of all alone with their pills. They tend to shut down when it comes to connection with the outside world. And I think that narcotics promote that to some degree, and particularly when there's nothing else, when it's you're just getting the pills. That is not to say, I would like to add though, that they have no role, and that they have no role in chronic pain. I'm not a doctor, but it's been my impression that there is a small limited role for narcotic opioid painkillers in the treatment of chronic pain. The problem is, up to now, almost every chronic pain patient in America has had one tool offered to him or her, and that is the pill, and that means that they're on very, very high levels of dope.
All the while, there was no scientific evidence that opiates treated or improved chronic pain. To understand what created the perfect storm that resulted in the current opioid epidemic, it's easy to place the majority of the blame on drug companies, but at the end of the day, the patient only has access to the drugs because the doctor wrote a prescription. And unfortunately, changing attitudes about opioids combined with the promotion of OxyContin by Purdue Pharmaceuticals created the perfect storm. Doctors who were complicit in this crisis blithely hung their hats on the scant evidence provided the two publications way back in the 1980s. In his book Dreamland, author Sam Quinones interviews Dr. Alex Kahana, a recent director of the pain clinic that Dr. Bonica started way back in the 1960s. With such high hopes in 1960, he summed up the situation with some eye-opening pragmatism. He believes that the U.S. medical system is good at fighting disease, but awful at leading people to wellness. They don't know how to do it, and the path they offer actually makes people worse. We're all aware that drug-related deaths continue to make headlines when someone famous dies of an overdose, but such high-profile cases are only a small fraction of the deaths that occur annually. In fact, the National Institute on Drug Abuse attributes more than 115 deaths per day to opioids and opiates. The opioid epidemic claims thousands of lives every year, but many people don't know that these deaths are often the result of lethal combination of not just opiates, but opiates with benzodiazepines. David Sheff?
The problem is, every one of these drugs is incredibly dangerous, harmful, potentially can kill. But what happens is most people don't just take one drug. I mean, if people are in circumstances, environments where there are other drugs available, and there often are, they're going to likely take whatever's available. Sometimes people will actively look for combinations that, give them what they're looking for, whatever kind of high it is that they've experienced. And you combine the drugs and they're much more dangerous. And those two in particular are responsible for many, many overdose deaths.
Benzos, as they're commonly called, are a class of drugs that are widely prescribed for their sedating properties, anti-anxiety properties. Well-known medication, Klonopin, Librium, Xanax, Valium. They interact with the GABA receptor by binding to the GABA chloride channel on the cell surface. This causes an inhibitory action that reduces neuronal excitability and produces a calming effect on the brain. Benzodiazepines should be used for a short period of time because they are highly addictive. Long-term use can result in tolerance and dependence. You can also render them ineffective and make symptoms worse. People end up in chronic withdrawal, so they can't sleep, they're more anxious, they use more, and a cycle ensues. People who are dependent on opioids tend to experience chronic opiate withdrawal symptoms, which manifests itself as anxiety and sleep disturbances and back pain. So doctors who are not trained as addiction specialists often misinterpret the reason for this as an anxiety disorder, and they prescribe benzodiazepines. The combination makes the addict feel better, but then the benzos have their own withdrawal, and we continue in the cycle of escalating use. Doctors endorse that escalation. Research supports this treatment because it does modulate some pain and the insular cortex firing associated with, but not in the long term. Again, short-term pain control. But the fact that opioids and benzos concurrently have disastrous results, they are often prescribed together. Used sparingly, they can be effective for some pain and anxiety, but unfortunately, this regimen often leads to escalated dosing. But the big issue with the combination is that they are a deadly combination. Opiates suppress respirations, benzodiazepines suppress respirations. Both affect the central nervous system's medullary control apparatus for respiration, but together they are synergistic. In other words, they are much more powerful than either alone. It's hard to overdose on an opiate orally, hard to overdose on a benzodiazepine orally, easy to overdose on the two together. And of course, once basic bodily functions are compromised, the brain is deprived of oxygen, the cardiovascular system shuts down, and people are dying. It should be noted that taking these drugs together can be extremely dangerous, even when taken as directed. This is, again, the problem. They took it just the way the doctor told them to, and they still died. The medical community is now being encouraged to avoid this combination. In 2016, the United States Food and Drug Administration issued a black box warning on nearly 400 products to warn about the dangers of combining these medications. The same year, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued guidelines on opiates which urge physicians to avoid prescribing the potentially lethal combination, and yet they continue to do it. Patients who enter addiction treatment report higher rates of concurrent opioid and benzo use. This population requires close supervision in order to have any chance at a successful recovery. As with opioids, the use of benzos can lead to physical dependence, makes functioning without them very difficult. Withdrawal from these medications must be medically managed. Stopping abruptly causes horrible anxiety and even seizuring and psychosis. Post-acute withdrawal syndrome, which is sort of an escalated anxiety, will last for up to a year. Sleep disturbance, certainly for 6 months. Shelley Sprague.
The average patient now coming into addiction treatment, there is no average patient anymore. It's a complete menagerie of people, young people, middle-aged people, all socioeconomic status, all classes, all reasons, all different types of reasons why they became addicted, how they got strung out. You know, what I'm seeing a lot too is these later stage pain medication patients who started mixing alcohol with pain medication because they couldn't get enough to kill the pain because it was being created by the opiates. So they started drinking, and then they became, staggering alcoholics, and then the underneath aspect of it is these pain meds that all started the whole thing.
When opioids or benzodiazepines are abused separately, physical dependence and addiction is likely, but concurrent abuse is potentially deadly. Before taking any of these medications, it is critical to understand their potential for misuse, abuse, and lethality. Even short-term use can cause physical dependence and be fatal. If your physician is suggesting this combination, extreme care and low dose must be taken to avoid the pitfalls. Every patient must actively participate in his or her own health care. Just because a doctor prescribed it doesn't mean that it's appropriate, particularly if you have a history of addiction or a family history of addiction. Educating oneself about the risks and benefits of the treatment being offered is vital when it comes to making the right decision. I want to thank my guests, Dr. Bertha Madras, author David Sheff, Sam Quinones, Dr. Anna Lembke, and addiction specialist Shelley Sprague. Tune in next week as we explore the drug company's impact on the opiate crisis. I want to thank Michelle Poe and the staff at drdrew.com for helping pull this series together. You can read it in its entirety at drdrew.com. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.